Hi guys, this is the first video of American History 1, the first series of video notes. So if you're listening to this as either because you missed class or you're just checking this out to see if this is going to be a helpful study tool for you. So if this is the first time that you've listened to and watched any of the video notes for class, then here's how it's going to work. I'm basically going to go through the PowerPoint and lecture the exact same way that I would in class, only it's going to go a lot faster. And that's because I don't have to pause for you to maybe write something down, and I don't have to answer any questions because you're not here to ask them to me. So make sure that if you're listening to this for the first time and you didn't get to hear this lecture in class, that if you have any questions, write them down and ask them to me, during lunch or before or after class or something, so that you have a full understanding of whatever it is that I'm talking about. In addition to that, since I'm going to be, just breezing through this, I'm going to be talking at my own pace, and sometimes that can be a little fast. So if you feel like I'm going too fast and you need to, get a little bit more time to write something down, pause it, rewind it, do whatever it is you need to do. Use the fact that it's on YouTube to your advantage. If it's easier for you to keep up with these videos to subscribe, then go ahead and do that. Otherwise, the link to this YouTube page will always be posted on the board in class. If it ever gets erased, just ask me and I'll make sure I give it to you. So this is American History 1, right? Unit 2. So this whole unit is just going to be about the American Revolution and the War for Independence. And I say both of those things because they are actually two separate things. The Revolution really sort of begins earlier or a little bit later than the actual war. Fighting is going to break out before we actually will sign the Declaration of Independence and begin sort of politically revolting against the British Crown. So that's why we call it the American Revolution and the War for Independence. They're definitely two different things. So if you remember, what we were talking about at the end of Unit 1 was the French and Indian War, also known as the 7 Years' War. So we talked about sort of the type of position that England was in at the time and the type of position that the colonies were in at the time, financially speaking, which was that the British were in a mountain of debt. If you remember, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, William Pitt, used the strategy of spending a ridiculous amount of money on the war to win it. And so because of that, they were successful and they did beat the French, but they racked up an absolutely enormous pile of debt in the process. So going into this next phase of this series of events, it's important to remember that how sort of desperate the British government is for money at this specific time. In addition to that, the colonies are doing pretty well financially. If you remember, I talked to you about how capitalism is really starting to break out in the colonies. Not necessarily on purpose, right? They haven't even used the word capitalism yet. Adam Smith won't use that word until 1776, and capitalism will already sort of be happening by that moment. But since the Navigation Act of 1660, when Great Britain decided that the colonies could only trade with England, smuggling has become a massive industry, and that has really fueled all of those capitalistic things happening in the colonies, and that is making people in the colonies a fair amount of money. Life in the colonies is better than it is in Great Britain. People are healthier in the colonies, they're wealthier in the colonies, everything is all around better in the colonies. Now that being said, Great Britain is officially, sort of arguably, but really pretty much the most powerful country in the world. I told you before, the sun never sets on the British Empire. It's that large. So they are definitely a force to be reckoned with, but at this moment, sort of a poor force to be reckoned with. So after the French and Indian War, relationships between the British and the natives weren't great. They did have, remember, Native American allies during the war, which is good. The Albany Congress, Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Hutchinson, they sort of worked that out with the Iroquois and their confederacy in the Northwest region. But pretty much every other Native American tribe hated the British. I mean, they were always really, hateful to them, stealing their land, not trading, very violent over and over and over. We're going to see continuous episodes between the colonists and the natives. It's just not a positive relationship, not at all like how the French were. So when they win the French and Indian War and they gain all that land, I'm going to go back to this map in the previous slide so you can see. Remember, this whole line right here, this is the Mississippi River, and that is where the British territory starts. Now, the Appalachian Mountains are along here, and that is pretty much where the people in the colonies lived. They lived between the mountains and the coast. No one really lived out here, but that's the land that they were just fighting for. Remember, they wanted that Ohio River Valley, and they ended up with that, plus some. So the Native Americans were very upset once the French and Indian War was over. They knew that now they were going to have to deal, especially the ones living in that area between the Appalachians and the Mississippi. They knew they were going to have to be controlled now, quote-unquote controlled, under the umbrella of the British Crown, and that's not something that they were happy about. In addition, there are Native American tribes in areas like the Great Lakes up here that hadn't even been part of this original discussion, right? The Ohio Valley and those natives, I guess you could say, sort of saw this coming, but the ones in the Great Lakes, this is all sort of brand new to them. Now the French are being pushed out and the British are waltzing in. So, there was an Ottawa tribe in the Great Lakes region, like near Michigan, and their chief was this guy, Chief Pontiac, and him and his people were very much against having a relationship with the British. The British were not as nice to the Native Americans as the French, as I've said before, and so Pontiac and his tribe really resisted British control as the troops began to sort of make their way in, and colonists sort of began to move closer and closer to where they were. So in the summer of 1763, Pontiac united Ottawa tribes from all over the territory, all over that entire region, to come to Pontiac's aid. Even some tribes that weren't Ottawa who just wanted to help Pontiac and his people resist this new British influence and to drive out the British settlers. And it was absolutely one of the most intense and very closely successful rebellions that we've ever seen. You know, we talked about the Pueblo Revolt in Santa Fe being really the only successful one, and this one came very, very close to being lumped in with that. They destroyed every single British fort west of the mountains. So every fort that the British had built that the French weren't able to like tackle and invade or anything like that during the war, Pontiac and his people were able to completely destroy it during this rebellion. And the only way really to finally crush this is to get the British to send in a massive amount of troops and just sort of squash the whole thing. So after they, lay this rebellion to rest, it's clear to the British that they are going to need to do something to keep things a little more calm, I guess you would say, between the natives and the colonists. So they do two things. Number one is they're going to increase their army in the colonies to 10,000. They're going to keep 10,000 minimum troops in the colonies at all times. I'll talk about why this is a problem a little bit later, but that's going to be one strategy. The second thing that they're going to do is issue something called the Proclamation of 1763. And what this does is this is basically an effort to appease the Native Americans. Appease basically just means to keep the peace and avoid conflict. So the British government passes this proclamation. You see right here it says, by the king, a proclamation. So they issue this law, basically, that forbids colonists from settling west of the Appalachian Mountains. So if you see this green line here that goes all the way up around where it says the 13 colonies up here to where it turns into a black line, basically what this says is that no, British colonists can move to the left of that line. This is greatly upsetting, right? Because the colonists have just fought a war to gain that land. All of this Ohio Valley and all of this right here, remember, that was what the Washington brothers wanted for the Ohio Company. Now they can't use that land at all because all of this pink now, that you see it where it says Indian Reserve, all of this is going to be reserved for the Native American tribes in order to sort of prevent any further, scuffles or problems between them and the colonists. People are very upset about this, and they don't want to be bound by the proclamation. So colonists are going to do what they're going to do, which is whatever they want, and they're just going to do it anyway. They're going to keep moving past the line, and that they're just going to like openly defy the British government, because the king isn't necessarily sort of there to see it happening. They're still in the process of getting, all of these new 10,000 troops over to the colonies, and a lot of them are not even stationed in these areas. So a lot of the colonists are just going to do it anyway. They don't give a crap about the British government at that point. They think this is a stupid law, so they're going to do whatever it is that they want. All right, so let's talk about all of our financial problems. So if you remember, the British are in a massive chunk of debt. Their debt is eating up a huge percentage of their budget every year. They've got to start paying some of it off, or it's going to get to a point where, they're $20 trillion in debt and there's no sign of it ever going away. Sound familiar? So the new prime minister, remember the prime minister we talked about before was William Pitt. Now there's a new prime minister named George Grenville, who you see there on the slide. And he decided, that his number one priority needed to be reducing the debt. That was what he was going to do. He was going to tackle that debt and figure out a way to end all of this and sort of get things back on track financially. The national debt at the time was 147 million pounds, which in today's dollars would be probably more debt than the United States is in now. So you can sort of imagine how crazy ridiculous their debt was. So Grenville's logic is the war that got us into all this debt was fought for the colonists. So the crown, the British government thinks it's only fair that they help pay for the war, right? That they help to alleviate the burden of this massive debt. Now, in addition to that, every other British citizen is paying taxes to help pay off this debt. It doesn't really make sense. It doesn't exactly seem fair to George Grenville if the colonists don't have to pay as many taxes. So what he's going to do is start working out some new laws and acts and things like that to make the crown more money. Now, Grenville knows that the colonists are going to try to resist this. This is not news to him. And he knows that they've openly resisted other things before. He knows about the smuggling, things like that. He knows that even though they're not supposed to be trading with other countries, that they are anyway. So he needs to make sure that none of that is happening. So instead of, I also want you to remember, actually, that this is not the first time the colonists are going to be paying taxes. There have been taxes in the colonies that go to the British Crown before. These are just new taxes, and the money is going to different places, and the way the British are going to be collecting it is differently. So I know there's a common conception that the colonists never had to pay taxes before this. They did have to pay taxes before this. This is just going to be new taxes or different taxes. So they need all of this money basically to not only pay off the debt, but they also need the money to pay for all of these soldiers that they're now sending to the colonies to protect them from the Native Americans, and they need money to pay all of the royal officers that the British government employs in the colonies. So people who run like shipping and things like that, like along the harbor. Now before, those positions, like let's say you lived in Boston and you're John Adams, not John Adams, you're Sam Adams, and you smuggle in a lot of stuff. You're going to do it through the Boston Harbor. It makes sense that you would want to sort of grease the palm, so to speak. You want to pay off the person who is in charge of Boston Harbor so that you can get in your ships and you can get all your good smuggled stuff. And that's basically how smuggling would work. And the people who always had the job of, monitoring the harbor or the whatever it was, it was also a colonist. It was an American who's doing that, not a British person. But now George Grenville is going to be appointing people from England to go to the colonies and do this to make sure that no one is, being paid off. So he's really going to crack down on that smuggling, and he's going to start issuing some new taxes. So the first one is going to be the Sugar Act, which was passed in 1764. The Sugar Act taxes sugar, but not just sugar. It also taxes textiles, which is like cloth material, things like that. It taxes coffee, indigo, rum, wine, molasses, a bunch of different things, a wide variety of things. Now, it actually does not raise the tax on sugar. There was already a tax on sugar. It actually lowers the tax on sugar. But the reason why the Sugar Act is important and why it is going to make a lot of people upset is because with the Sugar Act now comes all of these new officers who are going to be enforcing it, and this new crackdown on smuggling. So before, when there was a tax on sugar, they didn't really pay it, so it wasn't really an issue for them. Now they're actually going to have to pay the tax. So while it's not the first time they've been taxed, it's going to feel that way because they haven't really had to do it before. The thought process was that this would bring in about 45,000 pounds annually every year, which is a huge increase in government income. So this is going to do great things for them. The problem is that this threatens to disrupt American trade. Trade in the colonies heavily relies on smuggling. This is going to eat into that. In addition, some colonists need certain items like this to run their businesses and support their family. If you're a baker, you obviously are going to use sugar all the time in your business, and now you are having to pay a higher price for sugar. Not only are you having to pay a sugar tax, but you're having to buy sugar from Great Britain now instead of from somewhere else because now you can't get any smuggled sugar in. So your costs just went up. So you're going to have to raise your prices. So that's going to increase the cost of the people in your community and everything like that. Things are just going to, it's going to be like a massive ripple effect. Everything's going to start getting more expensive. So this is really a big problem for the colonists. They're very unhappy. The second act that he will pass is in 1765, and it is called the Quartering Act. So they're bringing 10,000 troops over here, right, to protect them from the Native Americans, but while they're over there, they're going to have to crack down on that smuggling. So Grenville says, let's kill two birds with one stone. Let's give our soldiers a place to stay while making sure that we are cracking down on smuggling by placing them in the homes of the people in the colonies. So the Quartering Act requires colonists to provide lodging for troops stationed in their communities. If you live in Boston and there's, a new unit of troops coming into the city, you might have to provide a room for 4 soldiers or something like that, and that's going to greatly upset you. Not only is it an invasion of privacy, but it might eat into your business, whether it be smuggling things or buying smuggled things. All of that is going to be a big problem for you, even if it's not necessarily like something that you use for business. If it's just something that you use for your everyday life, this is a very bad thing. And then the final thing that's going to sort of be the last straw for the colonists, not the real last straw, but the last straw of these first 3, is the Stamp Act, also passed in 1765. So the Stamp Act enraged the colonists more than these other 2, a lot more. This is not a tax on stamps. I know because of the Sugar Act that you would think that the Stamp Act would be a tax on stamps. That's not what it is. The Stamp Act creates a law that says that all paper things, newspapers, legal documents, contracts, marriage licenses, land deeds, even playing cards, everything that involves paper has to have a stamp on it from the British government. That stamp is going to cost you money. Now, the reason why this is very upsetting for the colonists is because they are the only ones having to do this. The Sugar Act is on all, of those items, sugar, rum, indigo, wine, whatever. It's on all of that stuff that is imported from Great Britain. If you live in London, you're not going to import anything from Great Britain because you're in Great Britain. So you're just by default not going to have to pay the tax on all this other stuff. So it's indirectly a tax only for the colonists. This Sugar Act is. The Stamp Act is the first tax that is specifically and only directly for the colonists. They did not pass the Stamp Act to affect the British people in Great Britain. This is only for the people in the colonies. Now, who is this going to anger the most? This is going to anger people that deal with paper, right? So lawyers, merchants, politicians, people that work in the government. Those are usually not people that you want to piss off. Those are usually people you want on your side. But nevertheless, this is the move that the British chose to make. So the reaction on the end of the British is going to be a huge uproar. The legal class, the people I was just talking about, lawyers, merchants, all of those guys, are going to be the most upset. things were bad, with the Sugar Act, and then things were a little worse with the Quartering Act, and then the Stamp Act just sends people through the roof. So a guy named James Otis, who was a guy who lived in Boston, in Massachusetts, and I've told you before, Boston is really going to be like the center, the birthplace of the American Revolution. It's going to be where a lot of this stuff begins. James Otis was very good friends with guys like Sam Adams and John Hancock and Paul Revere, and he proposed that they have a meeting to talk about and take action against the Stamp Act. So they all met together in New York City in October. All but 4 colonies sent people there. They sent delegates. Delegates are just people that are meant to represent you. Everyone but 4 colonies sent delegates to New York in October to discuss all of this, and we called that meeting the Stamp Act Congress. What they did at the Stamp Act Congress is they wrote something called the Declaration of Rights and Grievances. It was mostly written by a guy named John Dickinson, who is a delegate of Pennsylvania, and he'll come back up again later. He'll be heavily involved in the revolution as we get going and in creating a new government. But he steps up here at the Stamp Act Congress and is like, I'm going to write this letter essentially saying what our problems are. The Declaration of Rights and Grievances is essentially a list of all the things that the colonists are pissed about. And the main sort of message there is that it basically says that they want their own elected representatives to have the right to tax them. Only the people that they elect should be able to tax them, right? Because if you're being taxed, you're giving money to the government, and then the government's going to spend that money. So you want to make sure that the people in the government that are spending your money are people that have your back and that are going to be spending money on things that you want. And if you didn't elect those people, they're not going to have your back. They don't really care about you. You're really irrelevant to them. So the colonists are saying, we need representation in Parliament. Parliament is the British version of Congress. We need representatives in Parliament that represent the colonies so that when we pay this money, we know that it's going to be used to not only our advantage, but the advantage of the country. We want to make sure that somebody in that room has our back. So the quick way of saying that right is no taxation without representation. That is the overall message of the Declaration of Rights and Grievances. So in addition to issuing this Declaration of Rights and Grievances, there's going to be a massive protest going on throughout the colonies, but it's really going to start in Boston. They really viewed these taxes and laws as being like tyranny. Sam Adams said that it sent the colonists from being free subjects to, tributary slaves. He's basically, saying that we are being run all over and ordered around by someone who doesn't even know us and doesn't have our back at all. Benjamin Franklin even went to Parliament during this time and gave a huge speech to Parliament and was like, any attempt to enforce the Stamp Act without giving the colonists a representative could very possibly lead to rebellion. Like, people are really mad about this, you guys. You really should take a step back and give them what they want or take away this tax. And the government doesn't listen really at all. So that's when this major protest begins. And we see a lot of people getting involved. The 2 major groups organizing these protests are the Sons of Liberty and the Daughters of Liberty. We'll talk more about them at another day, but you should know those 2 groups. And they are doing things like organizing a boycott. So a boycott is when you don't buy a specific product to push up your political idea, basically. So they actually didn't call it a boycott, though, because the word boycott hadn't really been invented yet. No one had ever called it a boycott. But what they were doing was saying, we're not going to buy sugar. We're not going to buy cotton. Not cotton. I mean, what's something that was taxed? Indigo, rum, wine, textiles. We're not buying any of that stuff from England as long as they're taxing us. And a lot of this resulted in, protests, riots leading to violence, and things got so crazy that all of the tax collectors who were supposed to be giving out those stamps, they were called stamp agents, the people who were issuing the stamps that were created under the Stamp Act. All of the stamp agents actually resigned all over the colonies because they were in fear for their life because everything was getting so crazy and people were getting super, super pissed as every day went on and they were still being asked to pay for all of this stuff. So in 1766, the British Crown sort of gives in, and they issue something called the Decollete Act. And what it says is we have the full power and authority to bind the colonies and people of America, subjects of the Crown of Great Britain, in all cases whatsoever, which is basically saying we might be giving you what you want right now, and we are giving you what you want. They do repeal the Stamp Act. They say, but don't forget that you're a colony of the Crown. You are under the umbrella and the reign of the British Crown, and whatever the King says goes, and whatever Parliament says goes. So we have the ability to pass whatever laws we want, and if we want to pass more taxes on you guys, that's what we're going to do, and y'all are going to have to do whatever it is we say. So we're not doing this because you want us to, we're just doing it because we feel like it, and don't forget we can pass more taxes later on. Now, everyone is so stoked about this. They're like, oh my gosh, yes, we won. The Stamp Act is repealed. They're going to listen to us now. Everything's amazing. The colonists pretty much ignore the giant middle finger fine print at the bottom that's basically saying we can tax you whenever we want. We're just not going to do it right now. So this is going to lead to some more problems down the line.